इसके बाद ना आप इमीडिएटली मानस को किसी को भेज दीजिएगा लेने के लिए। नहीं खुद ही आता है। इस बार क्यों नहीं आया? इस बार तो यहाँ पे कितने साल अभी ऐसे किसी को पीछे से भेज देंगे अगर ऐसा पीछे से यहाँ से रास्ता है ना मानस को भेज दीजिए। हाँ हाँ मानस को ऐसे निकल के पीछे ठीक है सर। That's welcome back, everyone. Once again, I request each of one of you to kindly take their seats. We are about to begin with the session. After a refreshing tree break, we are here for a plenary session on forest conservation and development. And for this session, we have with us Dr. Peter Holmgren, Director, Center for International Forestry Research. At C4, Dr. Holmgren leads a team of more than 200 scientists and a staff operating together with partner institutions over 40 countries. Dr. Holmgren is credited for leading the dialogue to enhance and broaden the role of forestry in the global development agenda to address the major challenges of our time, that is poverty, food security, climate change, and green economy. Thank you, sir, for being here with us. We have another moderator today, Dr. P.R. Sinha, Country Head IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. Mr. Sinha distinguishes career spans for more than 3 decades in the field of natural resource management. He joined Indian Forest Services in 1977 and served in various capacities at state and federal government level. Prior joining IUCN, he was Director, Wildlife Institute of India. Thank you, sir, for being here with us and being moderator for this session. We also have 2 keynote speakers, Rob T. Fegley, Director and National President of the Institute of Foresters of Australia, and Dr. Tim Ryan, Chair, British Columbia Forest Practices Board, Canada. We have moderators for this session, Dr. S.K. Sharma and Dr. Mridula Negi. Now, I hand over the stage to the moderators of the session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those introductions, and welcome back, everyone. We now have an hour and a half ahead of us, which will dive into some very interesting questions about how do we organize ourselves to deal with the broad forestry issues and conversations out there. We've heard over the past sessions, the first day and this morning, that the forestry issues are broader than traditionally. They have more stakeholders than traditionally. They are very influenced by international processes, which in turn influence the governments, which in turn influences the policies that are being deployed, and which in turn influences everybody. And we think that sometimes our actions should be totally in line with what's coming from the top. But we also heard that a lot of the interest and actions and commitments and engagements are happening on the ground. Maybe those priorities are not the same priorities as is coming from the top. And inevitably, we end up in many situations where we have debates, conflicts, needs for resolutions, discrepancies in the debate and influences on the politics, etc. So the general question that I would like to ask the 2 presenters today, and they're going to give their own picture and their own background, is how can we organize the multi-stakeholder conversation on priorities, trade-offs, monitoring and evaluation, certification to best serve sustainable forestry? In other words, this is more an institutional question and a process question. And I look very much forward to hear what the presenters will tell us. Before we go to that, I'd like to pass over to Dr. Sinha to introduce yourself and your view on the conference so far.
Yeah. No, I mean, Ms. Nautiyal has already introduced all of us while we are busy with, organizing this. Thank you, everybody, and it's a great pleasure being in this August gathering. The theme is forest conservation and development. So that's always a challenge for a forester because he has to answer these questions to the political masters, whether you are an agency for development of the people, economic development, and all those things. And we often run into difficulties in articulating forest conservation as a tool for development. So some few thoughts for a few minutes I will share as a professional forester working in the field of largely wildlife conservation, and now as a member of IUCN community as country head in Delhi. Let us first of all have firm belief in ourselves that forest conservation is development. Unless we believe that it is an engine of development, we cannot have very constructive dialogue and meaningful conclusions. I personally believe that yes, if you have a proper strategy, the forest conservation can meet the ends of economic development and imperatives with which the political masters and other agencies are concerned. One of the key, as you also have heard in some of the presentations, earlier presentations, the problem of communicating. The foresters normally have a problem of communicating to different publics outside world. So I will further amplify to say that it's not just communicating what you believe, but communicating in a way which is aligned to the thinking of the listener, to the thinking of the other agencies. And that's why it is called in interpretation that whatever you talk, it should be directed at the level of appreciation of the recipient. That is very, very important. And perhaps one of the things which we can, as foresters community, we can start thinking is that the SDGs, whether it's going to drive the growth agenda till 2030, and Government of India with this NDC is already committed to it. And this government means business when it says that our NDCs define our trajectory of growth. It is committed to that. In this entire scenario, where is our niche? Strategically, I always have felt that we should not confine ourselves with the agenda, SDG agenda, item number 15. We have to link it in the entire ecosystem of the SDG agenda, particularly goal 1, which is regarding poverty alleviation, the goal 2, the food security, the goal number 3, that is the healthy life, clean water, air and soil, and of course, goal 13, which talks about climate resilience. So we should be projecting ourselves as an institution, as a group, as an organization, which not only addresses the issues of degradation of landscapes, but also addresses these allied issues. So with this, I close, and our presenters will be talking to and when in the end, we will be answering the questions. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So what we will do is that we will listen to Tim Ryan first. We'll take some clarifying questions after his talk. We'll continue with Rob and again clarifying questions, and hopefully we will have some time for questions from the floor of a general nature after that. So without further ado, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, PR. Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure and honor to be here at the Commonwealth Forestry Congress today. I've been fascinated with the country of India. I arrived very early Saturday morning, and the people, you are so polite, so welcoming. Thank you very much. And your country, like I said, is fascinating. I can't get enough of it right now. I'm here to talk to you about a couple things. I'm going to talk with respect to good forest governance and institutions and things like that. So firstly, I'll give you a little brief overview about sustainable forest management in Canada. And I'm going to breeze through that fairly quickly because Rory Gilson, the Director General from the Canadian Forest Service, covered some of that yesterday. And then secondly, the meat in this sandwich here is going to be, I'm talking about the role of independent oversight in resource management. An example from the province of British Columbia in Canada, and the example is called the Forest Practices Board. And hopefully at the end of this, I want to leave two messages with you. One is that Canadian sustainable forest management practices achieve a balance between the demand for economic benefits for Canadians and the need to conserve the forests. And that the second message will be that independent oversight of forest resource management is a valuable tool in addressing public concerns, building public trust, and ensuring continuous improvement of those forest practices. So, 94% of the forested land in Canada is publicly owned. So when one starts to think about management of the natural resources or stewardship, you ask yourself, what does the public want? The public wants clean air, fresh water, healthy landscapes. It also wants to earn a livelihood and enjoy the forest. The public wants a commitment from resource managers to carefully and responsibly manage the public's resources. This is the essence of stewardship. The background photo I've chosen here is an example of what the public does not want. This picture is of a harvested area in southeastern BC. The forest licensee that proposed this cut block did all his planning properly. He did his hydrological assessments well. He did his geotechnical assessments. He did his terrain assessments. He did everything he was supposed to do. He carefully built the roads into that harvest area, and he carefully reforested it as well, only to find a few years later a mineral exploration company came along looking for a valuable mineral in that hillside and created that mess. So the public doesn't want that. The public wants us to integrate our businesses together. The public wants the same standard no matter the sector or the industry that's developing that area. The public wants better than this. Canada is a federation made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. The responsibility for sustainable forest management, as you heard yesterday from Rory, lies with the provinces, not the federal government. It's the provinces that set the legislation, the regulations, the policy and the practices. And then there's the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers in Canada, a national forum for the federal and provincial governments to get together to discuss forestry issues of concern. So I'm going to whip through this one. We already covered off how much forest Canada has and other people. Let's go to Canada defines sustainable forest management as using and caring for forests to maintain their environmental, social, and economic values and benefits over time. So environmental values such as biological diversity, wildlife habitat, and ecosystem services. Social values such as employment, recreation, and culture. Economic values such as timber products, tourism, and other resources. And forest sustainability is measured against criteria and indicators that represent the full range of forest values and form the basis of individual provincial regulations as well as contribute to forest certification standards. I'll roll through this one in terms of science. Sorry, John. Legal frameworks. In Canada, the legal frameworks developed by the provinces require that all forest licensees meet rigorous sustainable forest management planning and implementation conditions to maintain their right to harvest the timber. Conditions such as mandatory reforestation, forest management planning, public and Aboriginal consultation, water management, soil conservation, biological diversity management, riparian area protection, fish and wildlife habitat management, and forest fire prevention. In 2016, the Finnish forestry research organization Indefor was commissioned to do a study comparing 14 forest regulation and certification standards around the world. And they concluded that Canada is one of the countries with the most demanding legislation in the world. The provincial governments are responsible for enforcing the laws and regulations that they develop. The majority of Canadian provinces rely upon provincial compliance and enforcement staff or groups. They also conduct spot audits, and they rely upon third-party forest certification schemes such as SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, Canadian Standards, Sustainable Forest Management Standard, and whatnot. Only the provinces of Ontario and British Columbia have separate entities that go beyond these steps. In Ontario, there's the government agency called the Forest Trust, and it was formed to conduct license audits every 5 to 7 years of licensees, as well as be a body that collects the money for the reforestation of the harvested areas, monies for forest stand management, and for forest inventory. Now this leads me to, in British Columbia, we have the Forest Practices Board, and that's what I am the chair of. When I gave a talk to the Assam foresters that came to visit us in Vancouver, British Columbia last year, I did a bit of research on your country and specifically Assam, and I came across this slide because it really struck me when I saw it. As most of you in this room know, this is the Indian one-horned Asian rhinoceros. And the reason it struck me was because looking at him reminds me of how thick and tough my skin must be when I'm an oversight or a watchdog body. Real quick, a little bit of background on BC. BC is approximately 95 million hectares in size. It's the second largest province in Canada. It's larger than the combined states of California, Oregon, and Washington states out of the United States, or twice the size of the country of France. It's got a population of 4.6 million people, of which 2.5 million live in the southwest corner of the province in two cities, basically, Vancouver and little old Victoria. 95% of the province is publicly owned, and BC is one of the most biologically diverse jurisdictions in Canada and in many places of the world. And it's combined with its broad social and cultural diversity, the range of values and interests, and that it makes up half of Canada's softwood lumber production and other forest products production, makes it a very complex landscape to practice forestry in. So why was the Forest Practices Board formed? Why am I here today, and why has it been in existence for 20 years? Well, we go back to the 1980s, and the issue was how the forests and their many values were being managed by government and industry was being questioned in British Columbia. It became known as the War of the Woods. There were demands for more parks, more protected areas, and more wilderness. The debate raged about clear-cutting, about old-growth forests, and other things. There were valley-by-valley protests and international market boycott campaigns. The government responded with very prescriptive legislation saying basically what you will do when you cut a tree, where, when, and why, and also how you would do it almost. Very prescriptive legislation. The government also responded with more and greater and rigorous enforcement. And as you heard yesterday, the government from Rick Jeffries, the government responded with land use planning to start to determine, okay, where can timber harvesting take place? Where will conservation take place? Where will there be parks? And also at that time, it legislated independent oversight. The Forest Practices Board was born. The board is an administrative tribunal, no different than some of the tribunals here in India. However, our rules are much different. So we're part of the Canadian system of administrative justice, whose very purpose is to operate at arm's length from politics and from the usual strictures of ministerial responsibility. For these unique bodies, the rule of law and the administration of justice are inextricably linked. The board sets its own policies and procedures and determines its own strategic direction. It provides reports to the public, as well as ministers and cabinet in government, and its work is not directed by the government in any way. I do not have a minister that tells me what to say, when to say it, where to say it, or how to say it. An independent board brings public accountability and access to forest practices results across the province, and it builds public trust. The board's mandate is designed to fill three fundamental needs: the independent evaluation of compliance with and enforcement of the Forest Range and Practices Act and the Wildfire Act. Excuse me. So we are a Forestry Auditor General. Second, the independent examination of public complaints about compliance and enforcement of the Forest Range and Practices Act and the Wildfire Act. So we are a Forestry Ombudsman. And then in the absence of the public's right to appeal decisions made under the Forest Range and Practices Act, we act in the public's interest as their surrogate to challenge decisions made by government. It's an excellent model in a province. Lights back on? Good, thanks, Peter. The board's supported by a staff of about 20 public service staff who are located throughout the province. We have a budget of $3.8 million, and it's been $3.8 million for over 10 years. So the board's done very well in terms of delivering the same level of service, responding to public complaints or audits and other reports as it did 12 years ago with the same amount of money. And by the way, I'm an appointment made by government. I have a 3-year term. I've finished my first 3-year term, and I've been appointed for another term. So I can't take credit for the board's performance in the past. And so the board's also survived through changes, major changes in forest legislation. 10 years ago, that prescriptive piece of legislation I talked about that told licensees what to do, where, when, and how, well, that changed completely 180 degrees to a results-based type of legislation, where licensees will describe what they'll do, but how they do it and those other parameters, it's up to them. As well, the board has survived a change in government. The board must do audits. We're required to do audits annually, and those are field audits of licensees. We are required to respond to all public complaints that we receive. Public complaints start off as a concern, and typically we'll receive up to 80 concerns annually from the public, and of those 80, only about 12 to 14 actually become full-blown complaints at this time. 12 to 14 is twice the number that we have had traditionally over the past 5 to 10 years. So we're seeing in British Columbia an uptick in public concerns that manifest themselves into a complaint, and a complaint means the board will fully investigate that concern, and it will take us anywhere from 9 to 20 months to do that. That includes field investigations, gatherings of facts, interviewing of people. The board also can do special investigations and special reports. The themes for these come from the themes and trends we see in our audits and what we see in our public complaints. Those themes might be forest bridges in British Columbia. It might be steep slope roads. It may be forest stewardship plans. Complaints that we hear from the public may be complaints about visual quality management, about large cut blocks, about hydrological matters, waters being sedimented or being diverted, about road density and road construction. The Forest Practices Board follows 3 principles of natural justice. First is procedural fairness. The board has procedures that ensure a fair process, no different than a court. It hears all parties, it uses evidence and field work to base decisions, and it provides for reviews and representations by all affected parties. The board strives for timeliness, always timeliness, but we're held back at times by the cooperation of both complainants and licensees and government. So when we do our audits are not just of industry and licensees, but also the government who has licenses. The board, in terms of remedial power, can only make recommendations. Any sanctions or actions with respect to non-compliances that the board finds are the responsibility of the ministries responsible for those acts. So in the end, the board must use persuasion. We must use the public reporting of all our findings, all our reports. All our work is publicly available. And in the end, it's the court of public opinion that will drive change in industry and government. And we find industry responds very, very quickly when you walk into the court of public opinion. Government will challenge you more on that. Can decisions be judicially reviewed? Yes, they may be, but only on a specific issue of procedural fairness. The courts in Canada have deferred to the tribunal or the Forest Practices Board's expertise in making decisions. Are parties represented by legal counsel? Very rarely in audits or complaints. They will be represented in terms of appeals that the board will represent the public on. Has there ever been public interference? No direct public interference by politicians. Has the board been effective? Well, I guess that depends on how you measure effectiveness, so I'll fire a few things at you. We've published over 550 reports to the public in 20 years. We've made over 300 recommendations. for improvement in practices and in legislation. We've responded to over 1,100 public complaints and written 350 we've responded to 1,100 public concerns and written over 350 public complaints. We've audited 300 licensees with over 290 audit reports. We've participated in 83 appeals to the Forest Appeals Commission, and we've garnered the public trust, the respect of stakeholders, environmental groups, ranchers, hunters, trampers, guides, outfitters, recreationalists, professional foresters, academia, and the public, as well as government and industry. We've seen our work used in forest practice and forest management reference material and guidance material, and we've seen our work used in professional associations such as the Professional Foresters Association in British Columbia. And we've done work for other government agencies, the Ministry of Environment and the Oil and Gas Commission. That slide I've got here is a slide of better management. The board invariably is criticized for always talking about negative things. Well, that's the land we live in. We do audits, we look for non-compliance, and we look for the issues out there that require continuous improvement or improvement period. So the board recognized that, and we've embarked upon identifying good or better practices that we see on the landscape as we travel British Columbia. This is an example of, mountain caribou habitat management. You'll note the patchy, irregular distribution of openings and tree retention designed to provide thermal and predator cover, retain lichen-bearing trees for the caribou, and minimize habitat fragmentation. So what are some of our outcomes of success? How have we influenced the behavior out there? Well, we've done this through fair and equitable application of the acts that we're responsible for. We've done this through continuous improvements in forest management and more consistent forest practices on the ground. We see more clean audits and more frequent, better, or notable practices on the landscape. So we've been able to leverage good performance across other licensees, across the industry or in government. And we've also ensured that sound forest and range practices have started to warrant public confidence. Success or value outcomes are also measured through public awareness and public trust. The social license that many people talk about. In 2015, the board conducted a survey of government and industry and resource stakeholders. And we found that over 80% of the respondents say the board's independent watchdog function is very or extremely important. So what are some of our challenges? Well, my challenges aren't like this fellow in this picture. And he's only got a little garden hose to stop that fire from burning down his house. My challenges are to maintain independence from government. And they're not my challenges, it's the board's challenges. The board's challenges are also to maintain their credibility in the eyes of all stakeholders. The board's next challenge is to produce timely, fairly reasoned, unbiased, high-quality audits, investigations, and reports. And as we heard yesterday from a couple speakers, there's the challenge around cumulative effects. And I've chosen a slide here to demonstrate the cumulative effects in an area of northeastern British Columbia, where we see oil and gas exploration, mineral exploration, forestry, agriculture, power lines, pipelines, wind farms, and hydro developments all happening on the same landscape. And let's not forget there's flora and fauna that live there too. Cumulative effects is a major issue going forward for all of us. The board also has a challenge of getting government to make board findings and recommendations a priority while we avoid turning the government off to what we say. Because we frustrate the government, we cause them more work, so it's a delicate balancing process. And lastly, there's the challenge of advancing the stewardship ethic I talked about earlier, the commitment from resource managers to carefully and responsibly manage the public's resources. So in the end, independent oversight plays a key role in building the public's trust in forest resource management and as well in improving forest practices out there. Are BC's forest practices and forest management better than they were 20 years ago? Yes, certainly. Does the board share in responsibility for these advances? Yes, undoubtedly. Are there areas for improvement? Always. We are never there. So with that, if you got any questions after we hear the rest of our speakers, I'd be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tim. We have time for one or two clarifying questions at this point. Only clarifying. We'll not go into a debate over things. So we have one question here. Do you have a microphone coming from the back? And if it's not a clarifying question, I will just push it to the general debate.
Fine. So let us see. I have 2 points. One is that you have mentioned that the board members cater to the public interests and not to their own professional interests. So how do you ensure that there is no conflict of interests? And second point is about judicial activism. You have said that the courts only see whether the procedural fairness has been followed or not. So is there no judicial activism in your country, as some say it is there in India? Thank you.
So I'll answer the first question, and then you'll have to repeat the second because I missed it, or maybe Peter or PA, you can help me with that one. The first question, the board polices itself. We represent the public. When we search for board members to serve on the Forest Practices Board, we look at their qualifications, their experience, their ability to represent the public's interests, not their interests. What they bring for us is the experience that they've gone through maybe in a sector or with a specific interest group. But in the end, it's the public's interests we represent. And the board polices itself, and that's our responsibility. We work for the public. We don't work for an interest group, a profession, or a government, or an industry. So your second question, can you help me out again with that?
I would like to know how it is ensured that the courts only deal with the procedural fairness part and not go beyond that.
What was that? I'm still missing, sorry. Okay, let's do that later.
We'll come back to that. We'll take one more question from the, second row, please.
Thank you, Tim. You made a mention of the mechanism of forest certification. I strongly wish that forest certification, being an important subject, could have been included in the plenary session itself, though it was there in the technical session. Because in India, I find a strong case for third-party evaluation of the forest management practices. Here it is being done by government and assessed by government, and government feels very happy that they are doing the best. And whereas there is a strong case for a third-party evaluation, and there must be country-specific forest certification schemes. And there are mechanisms in India that are being put in place outside the government system for such a kind of evaluation. I am glad that the board, British Columbia board, is working as a watchdog of forestry operations. I do not know whether this kind of acceptance would be there in our own country, but certainly a mechanism where a third-party assessment evaluation of the forestry operations is done should be welcome, and this should include the efforts made by the government for raising plantations outside the forest under agroforestry system. Thank you.
Okay, we take that as a comment. Finally, then, from the front row here, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm very happy and gratified. Tim Ryan liked India. But if I can ask, please don't take it as an odd question, that when, Tim, you were drawing up the presentation and getting your thoughts in order, you would have been, of course, conscious that you'd be addressing an audience from India, Indian implementers and practitioners. And we all know, you don't have to respond immediately, that so many theories, whether Schumacher or Ehrlich, that time population bomb, Garrett Hardin, Rachel Carson, and finally Mrs. Gandhi's speech in Stockholm, there are extremes of poverty, destitution, and
I'm sorry, can you come to the clarifying question, please?
Sir, I have already apologized that I'm trying to avoid I'm embossing much of what I might ask later. But implementation and doability is difficult in a country like India, and I'm just trying to draw the distinction between a very advanced country and that is industrially advanced, and of course where the problems of controlling could be extreme, the implementation, because we spoke of the control board and defining standards. So when you have a standard in a place like India, to that extent, implementation of measurability, that becomes a question. And we'll come to that in the course of the day. Thank you, sir.
Couple quick comments. And one of the parallels I'd like to draw is we need independent oversight for our police forces. And we cannot rely upon our police force to be its own oversight body. And that's the example I'd like to use. I see a lot of heads nodding. So the same principle applies to the public's resource. If we're going to allow the regulator, being government, or the licensee industry to be their own policeman, do we have a conflict of interest? Yes, possible. You cannot have your regulator be your independent overseer. So, and once governments or people can get their head around that, and really it's the people that are going to drive that push, that government, you do your job, but we still need somebody to check on you, no different than the policeman. And I thought of another example, and it goes to my question I asked in the previous session. As foresters, we also require a body to ensure that we act in a professional manner. And what that professional manner needs to be defined, standards, ethics, who our responsibility to is first, i.e. the public, not my employer, things like that. So we need independent oversight with respect to our regulators. As well, we need oversight or bodies that govern our profession of the practice of forestry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim, for those replies. We'll now turn to our second presenter in this session. Rob, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Peter and Tim, for your presentation. Firstly, before I start, I'd just also like to thank Dr. Savita and all the organising committee here at FRI and the CFC, the Commonwealth Forestry Conference, for the invitation to come and speak to you this morning about a topic that's very near and dear to me, which is forestry in Australia. I'm going to base my comments on just a little bit of my experience in this, but I'm going to diverge a little bit from the way Tim's presented his, which is a very structured process. A lot of mine will be comments about things I've seen over the last 37 years of my career. And I'm going to draw on some experiences of a number of projects in particular and background, just so you've got some idea of the things that I do. I've been involved in an Indigenous Australian, or for Australian Aborigines, an economic development project on Cape York where we built a hardwood sawmill. I work for the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service as a regional advisory councillor on the far south coast of New South Wales. I'm involved with Greening Australia in Victoria that look at major projects, major conservation projects, restoring wetlands, improving biodiversity structures and connections on corridors on private and public land. And of course, I'm also the chair of Forestry Tasmania, and I'm extremely proud of the work that Forestry Tasmania does as a state forest agency in that state. And I'm a national president of the Institute of Foresters and co-chair of the Commonwealth Government's Forest Industry Advisory Council. So what I want to talk about is just to say, where is Australian forestry today? Where does it come from? And and what future does it have. But I just want a couple of overview points. In my opinion, Australia can do more. We can do much more, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Our history, depending from which perspective you look at, is kind of good or kind of bad, and you can make up your mind after I've provided you with some comments this morning. We also have developed, unfortunately, like many people have talked about, these silos in the way in which governments operate. And we have 3 levels of government: a Commonwealth, state and local government. And states manage land use, and so every state is different. So forest management in each state is different. But I'd like to refer to a reference from one of Australia's sort of famous authors and commentators, Jackie French, and she wrote a book called Let the Land Speak, where she was trying to explain, and does very well, about listening to the landscape in Australia to understand how it works. And she makes a comment very early in that book that in Australia we have far too much centrally heated and air-conditioned policy. And I think it's a wonderful definition of that top-down approach. Ultimately, where we need to be is a much more integrated and landscape approach that crosses tenures and really start to build these things together. So, where's Australian forestry now? We have 125 million hectares of forest in Australia, with large areas of national park and private natural forest areas significant. It's 3 times the public forest management area at 33 million hectares. We have a large area of leasehold, and leasehold is essentially a strange construct, which is the Crown still owns the land is leased out to leaseholders on long-term covenants, but they still tend to retain the rights of the trees. But those forests on that land are not necessarily part of sustained yield calculations, so they're outside the normal state forest process. Now, multiple use forests, which where we do timber harvesting, is less than 6% of the total forest area, and it's about 10 million hectares. We have 2 million hectares of plantations. I'll make a comment right at the bottom there that Indigenous Australians either own, manage or control 41 million hectares of forest in Australia, which is around a third of that. But they're essentially not part of the major debate, and that's a failing. Our plantation area, roughly a bit over 1 million of softwood and around 900,000 hectares of hardwood, mostly in the temperate region of Australia and around the seaboard, which is the higher rainfall areas. The centre part of Australia is too dry to grow trees, mostly arid and desert. One thing I like to do is we talk a little bit about how Australia was ranked in the world, and this has come up with a number of people over the past day about India's ranking. Well, you can see India is ranked as number 10. Australia sits there as number 7. No surprise that the Russian Federation, Brazil and Canada are the top 3 in terms of forest area. The thing that I like to look at, though, because I'm a forester and a farmer, a bit like Sir Harry Studham, who talked a bit before, I'm interested in stocking. I'm interested in understanding how on the globe are our resources spread about. So how much forest do we have on a per capita basis? And you reorganise this list and it comes up quite interestingly. You can see that Canada, on a per capita basis, has more forest per person than any other major country in the world, followed by Russia, and then third is Australia. You can see a big difference between third and fourth, going down to Brazil, between 5 in Australia, 5 hectares per person, down to 2.5 in Brazil. China and India, not surprisingly, because of the populations in each of those countries, are much smaller, 0.15 of a hectare in China and 0.05 in India. We can do more in Australia. And I think the snapshot here is just to give you a bit of an idea of what we actually do, just forest industry in Australia. Total log harvest is nearly 30 million. That's the highest it's ever been, thanks to the plantation estate that we have. Our apparent consumption in a round log equivalent is around about 19, so we've got about a 10 million cubic metre surplus. Yet, if you look at our major exports and our major imports, hardwood wood chips has been for 30 years, 40 years probably. Our major imports of printing and writing paper, but we have an import deficit of $2.5 billion. So I contend as to whether or not Australians should accept this. Now, if you can think of this in a number of ways. You can think about it economically. You can say, in an economic sense, should Australia accept this? Yes, it should. There is no economic argument for us to do any more. Supply equals demand. We're a wealthy country. We can buy our products on trade. Trade will balance things out. There is no economic argument for us to change this. The challenge I've always said to people is it's not an economic one. It's more of a moral or a social or an environmental one. We are a large country with a lot of space. We're quite wealthy in compared to many, and we have the skills and the space to actually do more and potentially to grow more. So I think that we can do, particularly in Asia where demand is growing. Our total harvest there of 30 million cubic metres of log is less than 10% of the import volume going into China. So we're only in 10% of their total volume that's being imported to China every year. So where have we come from? Australia's first Indigenous Australians came to Australia via a land bridge from Asia 50,000 years ago. We don't really have very good recordings of how they lived and their lifestyles. We've had to put it together in a very piecemeal fashion. And like Peter's slide yesterday from Germany, it's really revealing when you go back and start to put that little jigsaw together to understand what it is. These two paintings by Joseph Lycett in 1820 are really interesting and they're quite instructive. The one on the left is showing a major fire in a forest while the Aborigines are hunting. The Australian Aborigines used fire continually to manage the landscape. And this has now been written in tomes that there was a very strong structure about the way in which they used fire to maintain vegetation but also create hunting grounds. It was a very, very important aspect of their life and how they sustained themselves. When you think about it seriously and you live in a continent for 50,000 years, you are going to have some pretty good systems. The one on the right again relates a little bit to Peter's query, which was a very open landscape, the way in which Lycett has painted this. And that's suggesting that the landscape in Australia was quite open when it was settled in 1788. This is the case. If you were to go back to that, and I don't know where he painted this particular thing, and some of them have been replicated, you get the same answer that Peter got yesterday, is it's much, much more vegetation. We have more vegetation in our forests and on our landscape where we have got these particular environments than there were in 1788. The other point that I wanted to make is that there is often context that Australian Aborigines were nomadic wanderers. That Australia was settled under the basis of terra nullius. It wasn't owned by anyone. That's been challenged and I believe is quite wrong. There are others more qualified than me to talk about this. But we do know they had systems of management and their own land, which they call country. And they love their country. I know that I live in our farm on Yuin country, and it's a very important part of Australia today, which it wasn't 30 or 40 years ago, to pay respects to your forebears past and present before you do anything and understand which country you are actually on. The sad thing about it is that most of us can say good morning in Australia in 5 or 6 languages. Very, very few people can do it in an Aboriginal language. There are 42 different dialects on Cape York, which is up in the north, and most of them endangered. Not necessarily all of them can understand each other. And so there's a lot of things that we need to think about when we're talking about Indigenous culture. Unfortunately, when our first settlers arrived, they essentially didn't behave themselves as well as they could have, and a lot of this culture was lost just through development of the country. Now, I could be disparaging about our British masters at the time, and point blame, it happened. It wasn't, and it's not a proud part of our history, but most of the Aboriginal associations were nearly destroyed. We have some of them still left and elements of them, but it wasn't a great period in our history. We also, in 1788, started clearing land to develop a great agricultural economy. And the best we can work out is that we think we've cleared something like 13% of the landscape, which equals about 70 to 100 million hectares of forest and grasslands. The little hole down in the left-hand side of your picture there in southwest Western Australia is a case in point, a really interesting one. That was cleared in the 1960s. The Western Australian government decided to clear 1 million acres a year and to create the Western Australian wheat belt. Well, they did. They created a massive wheat production zone, but they also created one of the biggest environmental problems in our country of dryland salinity. The sad part about it was the government was told in a paper to the Royal Society in 1924, I think by Walter Ernest Wood, that if you cleared the vegetation in Western Australia, you would end up with a salt problem. We know that, we still did it. Sad. So Through that first 200 years, in terms of forest, a lot of things, Aboriginal culture was lost or smashed and a lot of their management techniques disregarded. Europeans were frightened of fire, so they stopped burning. So they stopped that burning regime. Vast clearing. Formal forest management didn't arrive until the early 1900s. So you had nearly 130 years before any real structure of management started to occur. And the early foresters didn't really know how to understand eucalypt silviculture. It was very strange, very new, needs things that the European forests don't. Sustainability, post-World War, all of those things, the state governments became the dominant forest management agencies in the country. Private forest owners and others were more or less left behind unless they were a big industrial processor that had a concession or started to develop plantations. But essentially it was government driven by the agencies. And then through the late 1970s and the 1960s, we started developing softwood plantations, and the Japanese wanted demand of wood chips for the Japanese pulp and paper market. So the fight for the Australian forests really started in the early 1970s. I was a student when I went down to Eden and saw this type of forest and harvesting operation not far from the chip mill on Twofold Bay on the far south coast of New South Wales. This was the sort of thing that created real havoc and started to change the dynamic, the conversation in Australia. As young students, and there are a number of people here that will remember this, we were awestruck. We didn't think this was what forestry was all about. But this is what was happening, both not only for wood chips, but clearing for softwood plantations. Same thing happened in Tasmania. This compartment is quite a famous one. It's Picton Coop 39. And it was harvested in 1989. It's in the southwest forests of Tasmania. And it was harvested for saw logs and pulpwood. And it became the poster for the Australian Wilderness Society in their campaign to cease clearfall harvesting and create further wilderness in Tasmania. It was really the beginning of what we called the forest wars in Tasmania when this particular started. So despite a lot of this division and problems and issues, it did bring change. It was a very divisive process. People were either for it or against it, and a lot of foresters had difficulty rationalising themselves what was going on. There were lots of parliamentary inquiries. Codes of practice came in. The Tasmanian Forest Practices Authority was established in 1987, and it's celebrating its 30th year this year, and it operates very similar to the way the Canadian Forest Practices Board operates. Environmental legislation came in. We developed a National Forest Policy Statement and regional forest agreements, and a comprehensive and adequate reserve system was all part of that process. Certification arrived in the 1990s, both PEFC and FSC, and most production forests now have at least 2 independent auditors, the government-sponsored or the Forest Practices Authority and the certification auditors. And I'm pleased to say that Coop 39 recovered, regenerated and has been grown thanks to the great work of the Tasmanian foresters. And it looks even better today. And you'll notice that the tree on the left-hand side is still the same one as that earlier photograph. The forests of Eden have also recovered. They're very resilient and they've been a little bit forgiving. We don't want to do that to them again, but they have come back. And the forest that I had before is in the centre of that minor peninsula to the right of the screen there, below the Eden chip mill, which is on the southern side of Twofold Bay. However, the protests are continuing. Still we see protesters coming out to the forests and saying, we don't want any more harvesting in natural forests. Very similar things. And it tends to be in Australia, it's driven by iconic species. Whether it be the long-footed potteroo, the right in Gippsland, koalas, which koalas, believe it or not, have moved into plantations in a big way. And I've really enjoyed the blue gum plantations in southwest Victoria, and their numbers are exploding. The powerful owl, peregrine falcons, wedge-tail eagles, grey goshawks. Swift parrot, the one below, is giving a major issue for us to manage in Tasmania at the moment because it's predated on by a sugar glider, which were imported to Tasmania. They climb the trees and eat the young birds. And that's another Australian native mammal. Or Carnaby's cockatoo in Western Australia. And if you look carefully, you'll see those cockatoos are sitting in a pine plantation. They have adapted to living in the Penasta in Western Australia, just north of Perth. So all of these iconic species are issues you need to manage, but there are so many of them. I've only got a few of them. You really have to take a much broader landscape approach because all the things that they need to survive on are interconnected. So concentrating purely on iconic species is, as one landscape ecologist described, more like stamp collecting than conservation. You can't do it. You have to bring all of the webs of life together. But the real threat to wildlife in Australia, ladies and gentlemen, is not timber harvesting. The real threat, in my opinion, is the 3 Fs. It is fire, feral cats and foxes. This photograph, taken on Black Saturday in Australia, in Victoria, on 9th of February in 2009, on a day where we hit 46 degrees and howling northwest winds. The MacArthur Fire Danger Index, which every forester knows how to do, went off the scale. We didn't know. We were in for a really, really bad day, and it happened. We ended up, 173 people died that day, through to just not being able to move and respond to the swiftness with which these fires came. It was the perfect firestorm. This is one of the fires, though, and where fire can be a friend. And this is the Kilmore fire, and it's been mapped by CSIRO, and it shows the heat intensity of this fire, and it's run south. The dark areas on that fire boundary are where the fire burnt hard and hot. The white areas to the right are where the fire actually went out. And it hit areas of low fuel, where there'd been a bushfire the year before, a couple of years before in 2006, 3 years before, and prescribed burning in the autumn of 2008, about 18 months earlier. Fuel management, which is what our Indigenous Australians did and would try and tell us to do for many years afterwards, is the key to managing the landscape in Australia. It does not have to be like this. This is the closest I've been when you go out into this forest to a natural resource cremation. It is an eerie place. Nothing lives in here afterwards. Nothing survives. Hot and dead. The cost on water supplies, erosion, biodiversity is immense. No code of practice, no protection zones, none of those things get hit. Everything goes. So where do we go to the future? Natural or planted? Plantations rolls off the tongue. We want plantations. We hear it a lot in Australia. This is where we want to go. But they're expensive to establish. We haven't expanded our softwood plantation for 25 years. No one's got the money. They compete with prime agricultural land. Farmers would have been on cleared land, but the encroachment of plantations they see as a real threat. So there's resistance. And they're monocultures. As Mike Wingfield would say, the president of our UFRO, it's not a matter of if, but when your monoculture plantation gets hit by some pathogen. On the other hand, we have natural forests. They contain local species because that's what we resow after harvesting. We have longer rotations. They're more biodiverse. They're cheaper to establish. Fewer inputs, no chemicals, no fertiliser, and they grow. They're much more resilient to pests. And in many ways, you could suggest that they are organic. They could be certified as organic production systems. And yet in this world where we want organic and green, we're trying to shut that system down and start up a high-intensity one. As I've said to people, if you look at it in the agricultural industry, it's like saying that plantations are the beef feedlot and a natural forest is the pasture-fed model. It's very easy to say, but does it really matter? In the end, to be honest, I don't think it does matter. The forest on the right is Tarkeith State Forest. It's on the north coast of New South Wales. It's Eucalyptus pilularis, it's blackbutt. Many of you could look at it and say, is it natural forest? Is it plantation forest? It's actually a plantation. But the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales is now having difficulty to harvest that forest. In 1965, it was a dairy farm, and it is now having problems harvesting. So does it matter? It's a trouble. It's a difficult thing. I don't think it really does. Public or private? Public forests did all the hard work, but they've got some real problems. They're constrained by public policy, by political interference. You've all seen this. We know what happens. They're not necessarily transparent in their pricing. They can suffer administered log pricing, so they compete with the private sector. It's all potentially a problem. So what we do thinking a little bit about this is private forest, and to me it's time that private forests took over. We have large areas, they've been ignored and they need to do more. It must be led, the public resource can be the facilitator and supporter while we transition into more and more privately owned forest. Must be led by industry. We need to find champions to champion small growers to ensure that they enter the market and stay there. We need a transparent log pricing. You can't find the prices for logs. Integrate with other industries for both growing and processing. Integrating with agriculture. Doing things together, working together. Public forestry needs to facilitate this but not compete, because in the past they've competed. And we need Indigenous owners doing more. And this is a small project run up on Cape York. And Indigenous welfare is a very complex thing. The cogs on the left-hand side at the top are all the things that you need to get right to improve welfare reform for Indigenous Australians. It's not just about money. We set up Cape York Timber in 2014. We built it out of second-hand equipment. We started as an economic development opportunity to employ young Indigenous people and give them a future where, in a part of Australia where there are very few economic opportunities. Young Quinton Walker is a breakdown saw operator. He had no experience in sawmilling, hadn't been in forestry when he turned up and asked if he could get a job when we were building the mill. He's been with us since day one, and he's now a very, very important employee. It's small. We employ 9 Indigenous, they're all males. We did have one female, but she left. But the business, I'm very, very pleased and very proud to say, has been cash positive for the last 10 months, and it'll look like continuing in that respect. It's all about giving people on Cape York, get them off welfare and give them reasons to live a life they have reason to value. So where to from here? I'm co-chair of the Forest Industry Advisory Council, and we looked at a vision and a goal. The vision was really about the forest industry will lead the transition to the bioeconomy. We need to move away from the problems of the past and start thinking about bioeconomics. We need to triple the value of the industry from about 20 billion Australian dollars at the moment to about 60 billion by 2050. We think that's achievable. And we achieved 3 main objectives, and they're not numbered because they're not prioritised, they're not ordered. The first one is about resource, and it's really we'll have the right tree in the right place at the right scale. It's subtle. It can mean anything to anyone. It can be about conservation, it can be about small farmers, or it can be about big processes, depending on what you want. The second one is we will produce bioproducts using all parts of the tree to a cellular level. We can't go on cutting trees down and utilising 36% as sawn timber and the rest of it goes to waste. That's unacceptable. We need to do more. And we'll distinguish, the third one is to distinguish ourselves as being environmentally friendly, socially responsible and valued by the community. This is a great example of the right tree in the right place. It's an agroforestry project down in southern Victoria, and both the forestry and agriculture work together in harmony, and they're both profitable. In terms of bioproducts we need to look at the bioeconomy, the biochemicals, the biofuels, as well as engineered products and wood composites. These all create better value and higher value products from every cubic metre of wood that we harvest. And how do we improve community support? This is a real challenge, and I'm looking and listening to everyone I can about this particular issue. The great challenge to all of us is balancing this conservation and consumption. It's very easy to say, well, we don't want to harvest any forest. And there's this issue of cognitive dissonance where people hold 2 ideas. I love my furniture, I love my wooden house, and I love my wooden floor, but you can't harvest a tree. Of course, it's illogical, but people don't see it that way. They're passionate. So we have to balance that with 9 billion people on the globe turning up. We need to give all of them, to feed them, clothe them and house them and give them the reason to value their lives. And part of that is a role we have to play. We need a greater understanding of not just production forests, these iconic species that we looked at earlier. We know a lot about those because of production forestry, not in spite of it. If we'd relied on our National Park Service to do that, it wouldn't have happened because they don't have the funds. And people believe once you've entered a national park, you've ended up, you've got it, it's saved, it's working, but it's not the case. So we need a more regional and community policy, less top-down, less of that air-conditioned and centrally heated policy, and developing a scorecard for all forest management, which means we put certification across all forest tenures, not just the production forests. Production forests are heavily scrutinised, but some of our parks and conservations are not scrutinised. Are they achieving what we think they're doing? Do we know what's going on in there? Is that the right way to manage those forests? And government has a role in improving understanding and awareness. So in summary, For future forestry in Australia, planted or natural, I don't think it really cares. I don't think it really matters. It's a matter of time. It's a matter of getting trees in the ground, whether you're putting in plantations or managing natural forest. The boundary is too blurred. You can't tell the difference. Public or private, in Australia it's now time for the private forest industry to step up. The government has done a fantastic job. They've done all the heavy lifting, built our softwood industry, built sustainable yield, applied research, but they're under constrained funds and they won't be able to keep moving forward. And so industry has to look at the private sector and lead and encourage private owners to start doing more. Certification and effectiveness monitoring is critical. We need to understand what's going on in all our forests, not just a very small percentage of them, to understand how we're managing the landscape. And finally, to start, Indigenous Australians need the right to manage their own future and land and need to listen to their management ideas. Solving some of our problems, they would have solved them in the 50,000 years they were in Australia before we arrived. We need to take more notice of them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Rob. That was a very interesting presentation about the history and the future of Australian forestry. We now have about 20 minutes left, unless anyone thinks that Rob's presentation was not extremely clear. I don't think anyone will think that it was not extremely clear. We can go straight into a discussion, and I'll give you the first word in a moment. I'd like to take my prerogative as a moderator, and maybe you would like to as well, to ask two questions for you to think about. You can answer them at your leisure during the next 20 minutes. One is, how do you, as two different but similar organizations, manage your credibility and relevance vis-à-vis the public? What do you actually do to manage that credibility? I checked quickly when I was sitting here, and I think you have a Twitter account with 600 followers, and you don't have a Twitter account. So what do you do? My second question is, we talked a lot about standards, certification being one of the sets. And then, obviously, we've had different standards over time. You talked about clearing for wheat in the 1960s. Well, that was the standard at the time. Establishing plantation, that was the standards of the 80s. Climate change and conservation is the standard of today. What is tomorrow's standard? So what's the process of updating the standards? So that's two small questions for you to think about. I'll open the floor and take a few additional questions. Lots of people in the front rows. Do we have anyone further back? Not yet? Okay, let's start from here, please.
There is a trade imbalance while you make the presentation. Trade imbalance in the forestry. More logs and the forest product you are exporting. And you are importing processed goods. So there is a very good chance for forest industry. My question is, how you are promoting the forest-based industries, one. Second, to what extent you are involving the indigenous people to get a share in the industry or the profit otherwise?
Thank you. Let's gather a small round of questions, and then you can think about the answers. Is that okay? Please, second row, yeah.
Thank you. From the presentation by President of Foresters Australia, I find there is a strong case for engaging private sector in rehabilitation of degraded forest lands in India. Here in India, this has been a very debatable issue, whether to engage the private sector in regeneration of our degraded forest lands or not. And it has been for a pretty long time. There are conflicting views, there are NGOs, sometimes NGOs opposing, sometimes NGOs supporting. So still there is not a very systematic and organized system to engage private sector in regenerating our degraded forest lands. Then private sector, corporations, companies, they have a lot of funds under their corporate social responsibility that needs to be channelized for afforestation programs outside government lands. So that is one suggestion rather. And then this session is on conservation and development. I make a very simple case that government has two approaches. One, to enhance the economic growth, faster GDP, then promoting number of measures for ease of doing business, make in India, inviting foreign investment, Prime Minister's skill development scheme. There are a number of schemes where we require a fast-track decision for diversion of forest land for other purposes. At the same time, there is a requirement for conservation. So it is a very conflicting situation. And it is very, sometimes it is very difficult decision. Like we are going to implement a river link, Ken-Betwa river link. That is a very ambitious plan to supply water to certain areas which are starved of water. And it is cutting through a tiger reserve, Panna National Park. It is a very difficult decision for even the politicians or the bureaucrats or the entire country as a whole. Not a very simple decision. So I do not know how to resolve such issues sometime. Thank you.
Okay, that's another good question. We'll take a third one and then we'll break for some replies from the panelists. I'm sorry, we have the question from the back there.
Yeah. Thank you,
I think we have a first question from the back there. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like the Australian presentation, especially in relation to the involvement of the public. It's like you're saying in Australia, it's more of the government that started the plantations, and now you'd like to push for the private. In the South African scenario, it's different. It's the private sector that is driving more of the plantation. But currently, because of the land redistribution issues, there's a drive to actually involve local people who are claiming the land, which was like previously their land. Now, the issue here is that many times when we interview from the socio-economic analysis, the communities, they're like worried about the time span, the rotation period, what to do, what the alternatives will be. So many times it's how to include that. Where the companies are being involved and using like outgrower scheme, it's worked fine, but on their own, the farmers, the issue is what to do within the rotation age. How do you plan to do that for the Australian scenario with the Aborigines? And the land where they'll actually grow these trees, is it the government-owned land or it's on their own public communal land? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Let's come back to the panel now. Tim, would you like to have a first go?
Well, Peter, I thought most of those were aimed at Rob about Australia, so I'll refrain from talking about Australia just yet.
It's a nice way out. I'll come back to you.
Thanks, Tim. Look, I think a couple of things just in promoting our industry.
Can I ask one question last, please? Yes, you have made your presentation that more emphasis on raising private forest with government facilitation. What is the framework, policy framework for that in the Australia? Number one. Number two, Australia is exporting a lot of iron ore. Do you have iron ore in the forested areas? And if yes, how do you reconcile allowing mining in the forest areas?
Maybe there are a couple of running themes through there, and if I can answer them, possibly the answers will come a little bit together. In Australia, land is managed, or land management is controlled by the states, the state government, which is, there are 6 states and 2 territories. And each state may do things differently, and they'll plan that down to local levels. So, but freehold land, which is privately owned, is a significant part of that. In terms of the forest industry, the reason it developed on the public land was because that was where all the organisation was. And that was really where the government decided they wanted to have a forest industry. We were short, we had a trade deficit since European settlement, and they saw that as an objective to get initially to self-sufficiency, but to try and support the industry. Sadly, though, what happened in that time frame was that the public sector, possibly unwittingly, competed with the private sector. So the private sector, unless they were large institutional organisations that had their own processing capacity, really couldn't successfully compete with the public sector. So they didn't have access to supply agreements, there was no open and transparent market, so they sat out of that market and continued farming. So Australia has, it wasn't until about 1995, 96 that softwood plantations overtook the harvest volume from natural forests. And so it's grown to that point. We were more or less in balance in supply volume terms until about 10 years ago. Now we have a significant surplus. But Australia, because of the way we've done planning, we haven't managed to develop the modern technology to process the wood in Australia. Our domestic market for large world-scale pulp mills is too small, so we have to export, and we have a serious number of cost issues. The Japanese, on the other hand, were very keen to buy our wood and would continue to buy that. We were 60% of the hardwood imports into Japan for many, many years. And we've still now, Japan, and it's now just been taken over from China, but Australia is the dominant supplier to China as well, just behind Vietnam. So we do supply those countries with raw materials. And it's an arguable debate as to whether or not we should be doing more processing. We process, we're short of sawn timber, so we process as much saw log as we can in Australia with domestic processing. The import of sawn timber is because we don't have enough. And so that's why industry is saying we want more plantations. Government doesn't have any land. The reason they got into trouble in the 1970s was because they started clearing forested land. They didn't have any clear land. They don't operate in the agricultural sector. So to ask government to do it again is they don't have the land, they don't have the money, and they don't really have the policy desire to go back into production forestry. They're saying, we've done our bit, we want to retire, we've been the catalyst for the industry, now it's your turn, private growers. And we see the private industry saying to them, you need to go and talk to farmers and integrate your operations with farmers. Now that's a frightening thought for a number of our big industrial players. They don't think they'll get the scale. But I keep reminding them that in Vietnam, the biggest hardwood exporting country in the world, they're bigger than Australia, the average area of a hardwood plantation in Vietnam is less than 3 hectares. So you can create scale by just doing different systems. So there are opportunities there. I may not have answered all of those questions, but hopefully that was close.
That's great. Thank you, Rob. Tim?
Sure, I'll fire a couple of comments out. Privatization of the public's forest land in British Columbia, I would say, will not happen in my lifetime, let alone my son's lifetime. BC would not support the privatization of forest lands, basically selling the lands to private entities, forest companies. The issues that arise, though, for forest companies are 3. One is, and I always say this, and let's remember, 35 years of my life, I was in the forest industry, working across Canada and in the States. 3 principles I have. I needed access to resources, I needed access to markets, and then I need access to capital. Otherwise, I don't have a business. If I have no resource, I can't run my business. I have no capital, I can't build my facility. And if I don't have a market, well, I'm not going to do anything anyway. And there's some other things that go along with that. But those are the keys. So an industry, a forest company, a forest licensee looks at number 1, is there access to resources? And then they look at the quality of that resource. They look at the cost of that resource. And they look at the opportunities that they can manufacture something out of that. Because in the end, we all can get the same manufacturing technology. It will eventually get here. If it's developed in Canada and it's leading edge, and it may be as well in Sweden, it'll eventually get its way around the world. But in the end, How I access that technology is my capital structure, where I get my capital from, how much I have to pay for it. If I'm a new fledgling industry, I'm going to pay one or two more points in interest rate than the next guy. That makes me less competitive. So as industry works through its access to market, access to capital, and access to resources, it also builds a case for competitiveness. And sometimes that competitiveness case is the privatization of forest land. And Rob, I'm getting to know more about you as I listen to you talk. Rob's coming at this from an industrial perspective, and I respect that. So in BC, we also have some privately managed forest lands, and those private forest land managers are part of a council. A council, maybe the council's not the right term, but anyway, a council that has responsibilities. The government has enacted certain legislative standards for those privately managed forest lands in British Columbia to be managed under. So even then, the government in Canada, in British Columbia, for example, will reach over onto private land and say, if you're going to be a private forest land manager, these are some of the standards we expect from you. Now, not all private land is handled in that manner. So anyway, some quick thanks.
Thanks, Tim. PR, you wanted to comment on some of the discussion items as well?
Yeah, I mean, particularly on observation made by Mr. Srivastava about the dilemma a forest officer faces in terms of conservation versus development. That dilemma will be always there, and I think the answers should come from the floor itself, because we have people in the audience who know how to navigate through this dilemma. In fact, forestry issues are not an issue of dilemma, but it's a trilemma, we call in recent parlance. That is economic, social, and ecological compulsions, which has to be taken into account for having some informed decision. So, Mr. Srivastava, sorry, we do not have any answer to the observations made by you. You know the answer. People in the floor know the answer. But definitely, I mean, one way forward will be to introspect based on the discussion which is going on here, learn from the other experiences, test it on the realities which we face in India, and then try to find out our own way forward.
Many thanks for that. I've been asked by the organizers to finish sharply at 1, but we have time for one quick last comment from our panelists. And Tim wanted to comment on my initial 2 questions, and I'm not sure if Robbie wanted to do that after as well. So let's start with Tim.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Peter asked us, how do you manage credibility, accountability, and relevance? An excellent question, and it's a continual challenge. So the board's credibility comes down to the quality of our work. It comes down to everything we do is publicly available and publicly transparent. He mentioned the Twitter account. I have a real good chuckle at that, because social media is a black hole for me. And we, in fact, have a co-op student, and we hire one regularly every year to help us out with our social media activities, whether it's our Facebook site, our Twitter account, and there's a number of other things. I don't even know what you'd call them. But for us to get our message out there, that's one way. To get our message out there as well, it's outreach. I go and visit as many communities as I can every year, whether it's a licensee, a special interest group, a community, or a First Nation, because they've got to know what we do. People will forget what you do, or they don't remember, or they don't even know. You've got to continually, on a constant basis, have presence out there. Peter talked about standards, and how do we update our standards in British Columbia, and I'm going to look at all the BC guys here. BC's legislation is basically 5 parts. The Forest Range and Practices Act is made up of 5 parts. One of the key parts is a process called continuous improvement, and it's a program called the Forest and Range Evaluation Program. So like any continuous improvement loop, you've got your plan, you go out and you implement, you do, and then you evaluate, and you find out how you did, how effective you were, and what you need to change then for your next plan. So BC's legislation is set up in that manner. Has it been effective at doing that do loop, doing that continuous improvement? No, it has not. Not completely. And it's a very difficult process that takes time, money, and resources. And any time you have anything that takes time, money, and resources in government, and I'm not in government, but I'm learning this, you're competing with other demands for that time, money, and resources, i.e., the hospital bed, the school, the highway, or something else. So it is a critical part of our management structure in British Columbia going forward that we have a continuous improvement loop so that we evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing on the landscape today and make the changes to our practices and our management for tomorrow. Otherwise, we're not improving.
Thank you. Rob, last word for you.
Thanks, Peter. I think the in credibility, in terms of our credibility in Australia, we take a little bit of a national approach, and through one of our organisations, Forest and Wood Products Australia, which is managed by industry on behalf of industry and government, but it is we do focus groups through an ENGO called Planet Arc, and it they measure how the industry is travelling. We do TV advertising as well, particularly through popular TV programs. Some of them you may have seen, a UK program called Grand Designs. There's a similar one that runs in Australia, and Peter Maddison, who stars in that program in Australia, has done a number of advertisements for us in terms of wood, and our Wood is Good campaign. But the Planet Arc focuses, tracks what is working, where are we, how are we sitting, and we actually track quite well. We're about 52% of the population is supporting us, which according to people like Planet Arc, that's good. There are others that are much worse than we are. So underlying, there are a lot of people that are looking at what we do and say that we're actually okay with. And that leads me to the second point about standards and how do you manage them. I think certification provides those standards, as do things like the Forest Practices Board, and we have both in Australia and certainly do in Tasmania. And by keeping those up to date, we at least can show to the community that we're doing things. In terms of social media, I sort of believe it's a little bit about trying to pick what you do in social media. There's so much to read and there's so much to listen to. It's about what not to read and what not to listen to that it's important to. So you've got to define what you really want to follow. And I'm a little bit like Tim in that it's a black hole. I mean, obviously email and doing normal industry promotions through websites, etc., I still find quite useful. If you want to know something, having a well-informed website is still, to me, a very useful tool, and it's one that I use a lot.
Great, thank you so much. Very happy to have had you on the panel. Great presentations, great discussion. I suggest we thank the panelists with a big hand, and before we close this session.
Thank you, sir.
By that, I'll hand over to the organizers, almost on time.
Thank you, sir. Now, we would like to honor both of our key presenters by presenting mementos. So I request Dr. P.R. Sinha to honor Dr. Tim Ray by presenting a memento. Thank you, sir. I also request him to present a memento to Dr. Rob T. Fegley. Thank you, sir. May I now call upon Dr. R.P.S. Katwalji, former DG ICFRE, to honor both our moderators. Dr. P.R. Sinha. Thank you, sir. Dr. Peter Holmgren. Thank you so much, sir. With this, we come to an end of pre-lunch sessions of day 2. I would like to wholeheartedly thank our participants and our audience for being here and listening to the proceedings now. I request you all to join us for lunch. Thank you so much.